Tonight on OMI Life. In our first episode ever, Father Christian Fini interviews Father Austin Cooper, delving into his childhood during the Depression years, his vocational call to religious life, his years in the Irish seminary, and the first years of his priesthood.
Well, congratulations first on celebrating 65 years of priesthood, Austin, for your faithful service to the Australian province and the Church in Australia. And I'd like to thank you for taking some time to sit down and have this three-part conversation with me and share with us, the Oblates and the Damazanon family, and the wider church, some of your experiences and wisdom, which has spanned over 90 years and 65 years of priesthood, which is an amazing achievement. So thank you very much and congratulations. If you'd like to start by taking us back to the beginning, Austin Patrick Cooper, born on the 14th of January in 1931 in humble, then at least humble, Sorrento, Victoria. Would you like to give us a little bit of a brief introduction of your childhood and growing up in Australia in that time?
Yes, indeed. I was born at home, as you note. I was born in Sorrento, and I was delivered by the local doctor, Dr. Cam. And Dr. Cam went back to breakfast with his family after my early arrival. I've always been very early for things. And he happened to mention to his family that the Coopers had a baby Austin, and that was then a fashionable car. So his young son rushed over to see my father and said, "Where's the baby Austin?" When he saw the baby Austin, he was singularly disappointed. So I started off something of a note of disappointment to somebody anyway. So it is a long time ago, and Sorrento was, as you say, a very humble place. Just recently I came across an aerial view of Sorrento in 1959. That's nearly, 28 years after my birth. And Sorrento, still in those post-war years, was a very, very small place. It's surprising when you see this aerial view, the amount of open space, open fields, right up to the main street, really. It's quite remarkable. So, the post-war development, particularly from the 1950s, saw many Australians, comfortable enough to be able to afford a seaside house. So you get that great building going on, really, from the 1950s onwards, I would think.
The other day you mentioned, just in conversation over dinner, your middle name.
Would
you like to share a little bit of the story of your middle name?
Yes, well, as you perhaps know, the Cooper family ran the Sorrento Hotel, and one of the long-standing guests at the Sorrento Hotel was a Father Patrick O'Reilly, a diocesan priest who was not a very well man for many years, and he spent a lot of time at the Sorrento Hotel. And when he was there, he would say Mass for the local Catholics, because the Oblates didn't arrive until 1926. Though there was a church there, I think from about 1880, little church was built, limestone church on the hill. Anyway, the family loved Patrick O'Reilly, Father Patrick O'Reilly, so I got my second name, Patrick, in remembrance of him, which is rather nice, actually. Yeah.
And the church at that time in Sorrento, which parish was it part of, and who was supplying Mass occasionally?
Yes, well, look, it shifted actually from being on the Sorrento side of the peninsula, sometimes in Mornington, sometimes as far away, I think, as Brighton in the very early days. But then when my grandparents were married, it was part of the Queenscliff parish. So the wedding party had to hire fishing boats to go over to Queenscliff for the nuptials. It must have been, I do hope that they were all sober and didn't get seasick.
Yeah, great adventure over there. So what is the most significant challenge in Australian society that you have experienced growing up? And I guess in the context of today, how might it compare to the current world pandemic that we're experiencing at the moment?
Yes, well, look, I suppose the years in which I grew up, of course, were the Depression years. And I must say that struck me particularly when I went to the parish school at Sorrento. St Joseph's. In those days it was a very small school. There were, I think, only 28 of us at our greatest number. And the parish priest promised us a holiday when we got to 50. Well, we had no more chance of getting to 50 than we had of getting to the moon. So 2 nuns taught in the school. Sister Alberta taught from preps up to grade 4, and then grade 5 to 8 in the other room with Sister Ildefonsus mostly. It was a interesting time to go to school. It was a lovely little school, very friendly. But one of the things I do remember, and the ways in which the depression came home to me, was in the number of times that Sister Alberta prayed for parents who were out of work. And there wouldn't have been anything like the social services that were available now. So very often it just meant that other people had to help out, which they did on I think on a fairly generous scale. But it still must have been very, very difficult for those families. One particular family I remember, and there were 7 or 8 children in it. Well, when the father was out of work, that must have been very, very difficult indeed. So that's one of the things that I remember. I suppose the other difficulty growing up was, of course, the coming of the Second World War. It didn't strike us very much, I think. We had blackout and all that sort of thing. And there were mines set off the back of Sorrento, and often ships went down, or a few ships went down off the coast, the southern coast of Australia. And there were defensive positions, mind you. They wouldn't have withstood much of an army invading. I think it was more to reassure, the media and locals that something was being done. But the thing that I remember most was the time that Singapore fell. And that seemed to really be a major disaster. As you know, the British and the Allies generally thought that Singapore would never fall, that it was impregnable. Well, as we know, of course, that it fell very, very easily, really, in the end. And so quite a few of the people that we knew actually were involved in the fall of Singapore. One family we knew particularly, the wife was actually with her husband in Singapore. So sure were they that the city wouldn't fall. Anyway, when the fall did come, she eventually escaped on the last boat out, and the husband was in the concentration camp Changi for the rest of the war. So, you knew people like that who were caught up in it in a particular way, but it really did impact on those of us in Australia. Yeah, so.
Did you ever live, we're currently living under a curfew. We can't go out at 9 o'clock. It's restricted some of your raging out at 9 o'clock in the evening.
Yes.
Can you remember ever living under a curfew in your time in Australia?
I can't remember a curfew. There might have been one, but there would have been one imposed by my parents anyway when I was a child. So that didn't matter very much to us growing up. So I don't think that would have impacted very much. But we did have blackout, and people would come around, if they saw a chink of light or whatever. And we had heavy curtains, and sometimes a lot of people had coloured paper over the windows and so on. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad curfew is controlling your partying at the moment and wild social life. There's been lots of changes in Australia in your time growing up and as an adult. What have you seen as an improvement in our society? What's a positive aspect of our society that's got better in time?
Well, I think one of the great things, I think, is multicultural Australia. I do really think that's been a great, great blessing, because as I was just reading somewhere the other day that one sociologist said, that the average Australian in 1950 thought that Australia was situated somewhere in the home counties of England, or perhaps at best in the mid-Atlantic between America and Britain. And I think after that, it became a much more diversified society and very greatly enriched in so many ways. And of course, and all of that caused some challenges and some tensions at times, but I think they were worthwhile living through for the sake of and now, particularly in more recent years, that has been widened to include lots of people from Asia as well.
Excellent. So for more than 2/3 of your life you've been a priest. I think you mentioned recently that you joined the Oblate novitiate 71 years ago.
That's right, yes.
When did you feel, when and how did you first feel called to the priesthood?
That's a difficult thing to answer, I think, really. I can't pinpoint it. I think I first of all decided that I'd like to be a member of a religious order.
Mm-hmm.
So that came first, and I think priesthood then grew slowly out of that. So
You went to
the
school.
development that took place.
You went to school with the Maris?
I went to school with the Maris brothers, and when I started to think about religious life and priesthood, I thought first of all of the Maris brothers, of course, because they'd educated me, and I really had a great affection and an abiding respect for really all the brothers who taught me at Kilmore during the 1940s. I went there as a boarder when I was 12, so I was there for the whole of my secondary years. But at the time I was, of course, at the university, and so that just grew gradually. But I did happen to say to our local priest, Father Tom Hipwell in Oblate, I said, I've got some sort of idea about being a religious, and he said, well, when would you come to the novitiate? He just assumed I'd be an Oblate. So I think that probably sort of sparked in my mind that I should think about Oblates and being a priest. So I think it grew from there.
Yeah, so after Kilmore High School you were at university?
Just for 1 year, yeah.
Studying
Law. Yeah.
And then, who was Hipwell, was it? Or
Tom Hipwell,
Tom
yes.
Hipwell encouraged you to join the novitiate?
He was he looked after the parish. I don't think he was normally the parish priest, but he looked after the parish, yeah.
And so you commenced your novitiate 71 years ago, and that was at Sorrento.
Yeah.
So.
Not an easy place to do the novitiate within stone's throw of one's family. Yeah, but however, we survived that.
I certainly know how that feels, having done mine in Mulgrave and
I see, yes, right,
my parents just nearby.
Yeah.
Was there any significant moment or a person that really influenced you to join the Oblates, or even to stay as an Oblate? I think that's a really interesting question. It's not, the question of why one joins is sometimes easier than why did one stay an Oblate is actually a more challenging question to answer, or significant one.
Yes, I suppose it is. Well, I think Tom Hipwell would be the one who, talked me through those early months of decision making. But then after that, I think really once I went to the seminary, which was in Ireland, we were sent to Ireland for the whole of our seminary, the group that I belonged to, the novitiate group. And I think it was probably people like the rector of the seminary, Father Dan Long, who I think was a quite remarkable man. He had for a time been a missionary in Sri Lanka, Ceylon as it was known then, and he came back and he had been a teacher for most of his life. And he really was, I think, a very broad, well-educated man, and a very fine priest and religious. After that, I think it was probably the man who was my spiritual director, who was Father Daly, and he was very good. J.C. Daly. We usually just call him J.C., and he really was a very, very good man, and he remained a great influence and a great friend. Even after I was ordained, we used to correspond, and I happened to be able to stay with him for a few days. Shortly before he died, he was then in Colwyn Bay as rector of the Oblate College in Colwyn Bay in North Wales. So I caught up with him there, and that was a very great time. Yeah. So these are significant people, and one retains, I think, a great sense of affection and gratitude for these people throughout life.
They're the touch points that keep us connected.
Yeah, they do.
To the faith.
Yeah, very much so, yes.
And how did you find the formation in Ireland and the church? Was there a great difference to the experience of church here in Australia to the formation you were having in Ireland?
Oh yes, I think so, yes. Well, first of all, I'd say about it, It was in a beautiful place. I was at a place called Kildalton Abbey, which is still a great educational establishment. It's now an agricultural college. But in my day, it was really a great establishment in a beautiful part of Ireland, down in the south, not very far from the city of Waterford, about 12 miles from Waterford, and in the beautiful Shore Valley. So one couldn't find a more beautiful part of the world, and I think every day I just rejoiced in the beauty of the place. So that was a great blessing, and I always like to sort of feel, you know, an affinity with the physicality of the place and God's world and that sort of thing. So Piltown, Kildalton Abbey, was a great blessing that way. Academically, I would say, look, I think one of the great things about our formation was this, that when Vatican II came along, I was able to very, very easily adapt to it. I think we'd been taught so well that you know, we were able to take the idea of development and growth and change quite comfortably. And so I had I've got no argument about the academic formation. It was always a very big community. We always had about 60 to 70 students at Piltown, so it was its own little world in a way, as I think lots of seminaries were. The Oblates had about 300 acres of farmland, rich farmland, so it really supported, you know, those people really to a very large extent. The bread was baked on the place, the butter was made on the place, the meat was produced from the place, a lot of the vegetables, certainly the potatoes, a very important ingredient in Ireland, definitely, were produced in the place, all that sort of thing, you know, so it was an interesting little enclave really. I suppose the thing that I found about Irish establishments generally, I think it would have been true of Irish education generally, that there was a gulf between students and staff that I was not used to in Australia. So I was very glad when, you know, people like, say, Father Long, the rector. I remember I was in the garden weeding one day, and he came along and talked to me for about an hour. And I thought that was the first time that I'd had a long conversation with him, and that would have been probably after about a year being there, you know. So that sort of personal breaking down of the barriers between staff and students didn't happen as readily and as comfortably as it would have in Australia. So that when I came to establish a seminary, I was very sure that that should be, at a minimum, that sort of difference. Because there is a difference, but, you know, people doing different roles. Yeah.
So you're ordained in Ireland in 1956, and you return to Australia. What was the province like when you returned to Australia? What was happening there? What were the positive things? What were the challenges of the province at that time when you came as this young, energetic, newly ordained priest?
Yes, good. Well, there were certain things happening. I suppose that one of the great things that had happened was that we had been made a province just a few years before that. Because when I joined the Oblates, I actually joined the Anglo-Irish province because the Australian houses were part of the Irish province. So we were part of the Irish province, I suppose, until about 1954 or so, when, or 53, when we were made a separate province under Father Michael O'Reilly, who was an Assistant General and who came out to Australia as provincial, but he only fulfilled one term because he was old and unwell, so he went back to Ireland, and his place was taken by Father Edward Ryan, Ned Ryan as we knew him. And I think he was one of the people who, with this new province, not very long separated from the mother province, I think he was one who stamped his own mark on the province in a very remarkable way, and it was this, that he was a very, very lovable, humane person. and he had a great warmth about him. He was no great genius, no great organiser, but he was immensely likeable, lovable man. And I think that he gave us a humane approach to one another, and deepened our humane approach in our ministry. I think we'd always had something of that from Eugene de Mazenod. I think it had been part of the Oblate thing, if you like, but certainly Ned Ryan deepened that in a very great way. So the Mother Province, which was quite well off for, manpower at the time, were very generous in, ensuring that there were plenty of people who could come to Australia. So our personnel numbers were increasing. I can't just remember offhand what the numbers were, but in recent years, even before we were separated, we had gone to Sefton. We'd gone to Moe first and then to Sefton, or was it the other way around? Sefton first, I think, and then Moe. And by the time I came back, of course, we had moved to Eagle Junction in Brisbane to begin preaching missions from around Queensland. We'd also gone to Penshurst in Sydney with another small mission band to preach missions in New South Wales. And of course we had a mission band which had been placed at Sorrento. Then when that was made a novitiate in 1950, the mission band came here and moved into this house. So this house dates from 1950, when this was the mission house for Victoria and Tasmania. So, missions and retreats were a very real part of the thing. But also, just as I came back, the decision had been made to start our first school in Brisbane at Iona. So we had a very experienced Oblate educator, Father Timothy Long, a brother of the man who'd been my rector at Pilltown. He came from Sri Lanka to begin our first secondary school, and he brought with it a great deal of, not only a great deal of educational experience, but a great expanse of attitude as a man of great learning and great openness. And he was a very likeable man, but he was not a well man, so sadly he was only able to work as head of the school for 3 years, and he died shortly after that, actually, of a rather serious illness. Yeah.
So that's the picture of the province you returned to. Your first appointment was to...
My first appointment was, I really was to go to Brisbane with the idea of going to Iona. And so I was sent to our mission house at Eagle Junction, where I was to go and study at the university. And I was looking after the public chapel at Eagle Junction. That was a lovely introduction to ministry, because in my first year I was virtually looking after a church and a community on my own, because the other members of the community were almost entirely out on the missions. But in third term of that year, Father Tom Shortall, who was at Iona, really felt that he was not called to education. So I was taken out of Eagle Junction after a short time and sent to teach grade 5 at Iona.
What an illustrious beginning.
Well, it was a great beginning, and I enjoyed it immensely. And I hope that the youngsters enjoyed it too, because it was meant to be enjoyable.
Yes, and that commenced an amazing career in education.
Indeed, yes. I started in grade 5. I'm glad I skipped the first 4 grades, but anyway, I started in grade 4, yeah. And then after a couple of years, I was nominated to be, a few years in grade 5, I was nominated to be the first rector of our seminary in Australia. So I was sent off to look at Oblate seminaries and to spend a couple of years in Washington, at the Washington Seminary for the Eastern Province of America, and I did my MA at that time in America. And that was very, very interesting and very, enriching sort of time. I loved being in Washington for those couple of years. Not a place I'd like to live, but I always feel very much at home when I do go to the States.
So you've been directly involved in the formation of priests for many years. There would be very few and we're going to talk about this later in your involvement in CTC, but there'll be very few priests of the Archdiocese of Melbourne or the province of Victoria and Tasmania that haven't been lectured by yourself. What wisdom can you share with a young person discerning religious life or priesthood?
Well, yes, I think in today's culture, of course, it is a countercultural thing to think about, isn't it? So anybody who's thinking of being countercultural, here's a great opening. But look, it's first of all, it's I think an absolutely wonderful thing to feel called to, because one of the great challenges that I feel, and I still feel immensely passionate about, is how do we give people a sense of mystery, a sense of the divine, a sense of the loving providence of God in a world which really doesn't want to hear about God. So that's a great challenge, and it does require faith and it does require commitment, but I think it's very much worthwhile. So I think there's a great pastoral challenge here, and I think it's something that a young person ought to seriously think about. If one is a person of faith, to think about this. Well, the faith, if we really appreciate it, we have an urge to share it. I don't think you can really have it and not want to share it with other people. So that's one thing I'd say. But look, as I look back on my life, I have been doing, very interesting things. First of all, I've been meeting a lot of very interesting people. I still get amazed at the people that I teach. They teach me so much by the range of their goodness, their interests, and their abilities. They really do keep one very much alive to all the goodness in humanity that's about us. So I'm very blessed to have had all of that experience. And also, of course, I've had a chance to not only meet great people, but to talk about things that interest me greatly. As you know, I've got a great passion about 19th century history, and the great love of my life is a 19th century topic, the Oxford movement with St John Henry Newman at its centre. So studying about that, teaching about that, doing an immense amount of writing about it, mostly articles. This has been, very, very enriching indeed. And I think it's also helped me greatly in preaching, particularly preaching on special occasions like retreats and so on. So, life can be very full and very interesting. If it's challenging, every life is challenging. This one no less than others. But it's also a very enriching thing, and something I feel very blessed to have been able to go through. Not that I'm at the end of it quite yet, but
a few more.
I'm still enjoying it.
A few more years. Excellent.